You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, we have some major news here. Four members of the Proud Boys, including their leader, Enrique Tarrio, were convicted of seditious conspiracy for plotting to keep Trump in power by leading that violent mob on January 6th. What does this mean for Trump's case that's currently impending before the DOJ?
Well, needless to say, Brian, it's not going to help Trump, and it may end up hurting him for a couple of reasons. So first of all, this is actually a very good day and a very good verdict for the American people, for our democracy, and for the federal prosecutors who brought some very forward-leaning charges, seditious conspiracy charges, which involve basically the attempted violent overthrow of the United States government or a violent attempt to stop the execution of the laws, like the Electoral Count Act. And the jury convicted four of the five defendants of that lead charge, seditious conspiracy. The fifth defendant, Dominic Pizzola, he was also convicted of multiple counts and is looking at many years in prison as well. But the four who were convicted of the lead count are facing 20 years in prison just on that one charge alone. And they were all actually convicted of multiple charges in this case. So the Department of Justice can sort of rightly crow a little bit because they have now held the two most dangerous groups that were at the Capitol that day, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, guilty of the most serious charges that they could have brought. What does it mean for Donald Trump? You know, Brian, here is the biggest takeaway that I see. Enrique Tarrio, leader of the Proud Boys, was convicted of multiple counts for the crimes that were committed at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, and Enrique Tarrio was not there. He didn't set foot on Capitol grounds. He wasn't even in the District of Columbia. Yet because of the conduct of his co-conspirators, the other Proud Boys, he was convicted of crimes that he did not personally participate in. You know what? You know who else wasn't at the Capitol that day? The people in the Willard War Room, like Steve Bannon, Mike Flynn, Roger Stone, Rudy Giuliani, the people in the White House, Mark Meadows, Donald Trump. This case has set what I would call an atmospheric precedent, not a legal precedent, but an atmospheric precedent, because once the Department of Justice succeeds in indicting, trying, and convicting people for what happened at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, even though they weren't there, that I think is really dangerous territory for Trump and company. So I would tell them all, y'all might want to buckle up, fellas, because your ride, it has just gotten a little bit more bumpy as a result of this verdict.
Now, just as a quick aside, you mentioned that they could be facing up to 20 years for that lead charge. I know that the Oath Keepers have also been convicted of seditious conspiracy, a number of Oath Keepers. Have they been sentenced in their cases yet?
They have not been sentenced. In these big cases, conspiracy cases with multiple defendants, what often happens is the sentencing gets pushed well into the future. Why is that? Two reasons. One, the Federal Probation Office has to do a full background investigation of these defendants and generate what's called a pre-sentence report. That is designed to inform the judge about each defendant who's been convicted and what the judge thinks is the appropriate punishment for each defendant. The other thing that happens is in these big cases, defense attorneys will file what are called post-verdict motions, right? Not appeals, but they'll try to gin up some motions attacking some ruling or another that the judge made and claim that, well, the whole trial was unfair because the judge made one or more mistakes. Let me tell you, those motions are routinely filed. They are almost never granted, but they do take some time to litigate. The good news is these people are all remaining jailed pending sentencing.
Now, I know that we kind of get used to the historic nature of everything that's happening right now, but just to kind of put this into perspective, how unprecedented, how historic is seeing these seditious conspiracy charges passed down?
Yeah, so the seditious conspiracy statute comes from the Civil War era. These charges are rarely brought. I think they were last brought out in Michigan about 10 or 15 years ago, and that case didn't even make it to the jury. The judge ended up dismissing these charges because he didn't believe there was enough evidence to support them. And, I got to tell you, that kind of smarts when you're a prosecutor and you get charges thrown out that you think you have a good faith basis to bring and present to a jury. So, I think the Department of Justice thought long and hard about whether they wanted to bring seditious conspiracy charges, because they could have settled for all of the lesser charges that they did in fact bring in this case, in the Oath Keepers case. Things like obstructing an official proceeding, damaging government property, assaulting police officers, and so on. They brought all those. But, I believe the DOJ felt like, as a matter of principle, they had enough evidence to argue that what the Oath Keepers and what the Proud Boys did was try to violently overthrow our government. They brought those charges and they paid off.
Now, I know that we can kind of maybe look at the Oath Keepers case as kind of a harbinger of things to come in the Proud Boys case that we just have this conviction passed down in. Were the Oath Keepers looking toward appealing the results of this case?
Brian, every single person who is convicted of a felony crime, a significant crime, appeals their conviction. It is a matter of course. One of the reasons is because if you fail or you neglect to file a notice of appeal on behalf of your client, the first thing the client will do is turn around and lodge a complaint against you for ineffective assistance of counsel. So it is routine for all criminal convictions, virtually all criminal convictions, to be appealed. I watched lots of the Oath Keepers trial. I watched some of the Proud Boys trial, including some of the closing arguments. These were well-tried cases. There was a lot of evidence supporting the charges that had been indicted by the grand jury. And I kind of like the Department of Justice's chance on appeal.
Now, we obviously have the seditious conspiracy charges and convictions, Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. Does that make it more likely that Trump himself faces a similar charge? Like, is this basically paving the way for that?
That's a great question, and it probably takes a crystal ball. I don't think that the prosecutors are going to be able to, for example, flip Oath Keepers, flip Proud Boys, and get those folks to directly incriminate Donald Trump. And that's why I say it's more atmospheric precedent. What Merrick Garland and the federal prosecutors have done is they have gone pretty hard, pretty aggressively, and pretty successfully after the boots of the insurrection, the foot soldiers. And Brian, I was in court when one of the defense attorneys for the Proud Boys, in closing argument, said the following: "Ladies and gentlemen, you heard the evidence of Donald Trump saying, 'March to the Capitol, and I'm going to be right there with you.'" Of course, he didn't go to the Capitol, but he said, "Go there, fight like hell, or you won't have a country anymore. Now get down there and stop the steal." In other words, stop the transfer of power. And the defense attorney looked the jurors in the eyes and said, "You know what, ladies and gentlemen, I predict those statements will be government exhibit number 1 in the future criminal trial of the United States of America versus Donald Trump." Rarely do I embrace and applaud something that a defense attorney argues, but you know what? The defense attorney was spot on. And frankly, I think when we look back, that may end up being a pretty prophetic statement.
Well, to that exact point, how does Jack Smith sit in his office watching this case? How does he use any of this information to inform his current case against Donald Trump for inciting the events of January 6th?
So one of the ways he can exploit this evidence is the Proud Boys defended on the claim that, listen, Donald Trump told us to do it. We were just following orders. I happen to agree. Now, mind you, that does not give them a legal defense, because if somebody tells you to do something illegal, it's not a defense that somebody else told you to do it. I would call it a mitigating circumstance, which means maybe some of these folks who attacked the Capitol are worthy of a lesser punishment because they actually thought their vote was stolen, their election was rigged, their president was being unlawfully taken from them, courtesy of Donald Trump's lies. So going back to your question, how might Jack Smith exploit these convictions? One of the things Donald Trump will say about his incendiary speech on the ellipse prior to the Capitol attack is, hey, that was First Amendment protected free speech. Here's the thing. There's a way to defeat a First Amendment free speech claim. The way to do it is if the prosecutors can prove that your speech was, 1, reasonably likely to incite imminent violence, and 2, intended to incite imminent violence. The fact that these Proud Boys in open court defended on Donald Trump told us to do it, and that's why we did it. Well, that knocks down one of the prongs of the First Amendment free speech
Well,
protection.
and the other, for example, is when he was told by his own staff, his own security, that there were mags there to prevent people from coming in with weapons, and he said, "Let them in anyway. They're not here to hurt me."
Yeah, he said, let them in anyway. They're not here to hurt me. And then we can all march to the Capitol. You know what, Brian? That may actually tick up a charge to treason, but we can talk about that another day. But I think Jack Smith can get some mileage out of some of the evidence that was developed during both the Oath Keepers trial and the Proud Boys trial. And there's one thing I'm pretty confident of. Jack Smith and his prosecutorial team have their eyes on everything, and they're presenting to the grand jury what they believe is relevant evidence and information.
Great. Well, we'll leave it there. Obviously, a lot to continue watching for in this case, among a raft of others. So if you want to keep on top of legal news, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.